Hi everybody, my name is Jesper Sundevall and I'll be your lecturer today. I've met most of you before, not in different contexts, in the health policy course or in the introduction earlier this semester. Glad to be with you again, unfortunately not in person this time around, but through this medium. Trying out some new technology here, trying to see if I can do both camera and PowerPoint presentation. And if all works really well, I might just even play with my Lego a bit, but we'll see how that works. Today we'll talk about SRHR and policy, and don't worry, I won't bore you for 2 hours. I'll see if we can go through some of the key things that I think are important and provide you with some food for thought, and that can sort of inspire you to think further about this. You come in with a bit of different pre-understanding. Some of you have taken the health policy course before, which is very useful. Some of you will take it next year. It's not critical, and it might be a bit repetitive for some of you, and I'm really sorry for that. But please bear with me and see that hopefully you can always learn something new. Let's move to the next slide. Hopefully you can see this. This is the overview of today's lecture, and I tried to phrase it around 3 keywords. All good things are 3, right? So I tried to label them as at the end of the day, I want you to be able to problematize around SRHR policy. I want you to relativize, and then I want you to think about how we can prioritize. All those 3 things are critical issues when considering SRHR policy. And throughout the coming maybe 30 minutes, we'll dive a bit deeper into all of them. So let's kick off the first issue and problematize. What is a policy? And I was thinking for myself, do I have any policies at home? And it's quite convenient to sit at home, and I started looking at my bookshelf, and there were actually plenty of policies. I have the Lisbon Treaty sitting here in my bookshelf. Don't know exactly why I have the Lisbon Treaty, but it's always good if somebody talks about the Lisbon Treaty and you get confused, right? I realized, I used to work at the parliament, so I have the Swedish constitution. That could probably be argued to be a policy, quite thick. It has, the all the how it works of how parliament operates. What else do I have that could be considered a policy? Maybe it's not a policy, but it's studying public policy. Could there be anything else in here to be a policy? Well, maybe not. But regardless, you can always also go to the Wikipedia definition, because I still find it tricky to actually define what is a policy. And if you go to Wikipedia, it defines it as a course or principle of action adopted or proposed by an organization or an individual. And takes as an example the government's controversial economic policies, right? So it's something very broad. You see the synonyms: blueprint, approach, scheme, program, schedule, code, system. It can be a lot of different things. And that you need to keep that in mind, that what is labeled as a policy, it depends very much on who you're talking to and on what you're talking about. And just to give one very simple example, policies can be big and they can be small. Looking here at the current slide, we can see Eleanor Roosevelt standing, with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, big document outlining the fundamental principles of human rights, which is still the guiding principle for much of, United Nations operations and then how country legislations are formed. And then you can have small policies, right? And this is maybe a silly example of, solid waste management policy plan for Minnesota. Probably very specific and locally oriented. And that's my next point, that policies can then also be vague and they can be specific. And this example is taken from a recent master thesis, a person who actually graduated from this program the other year. And she looked at what is known as essential packages of health services. And you might be familiar with this term or you might not be, but basically that's in In many low and middle income countries, we have what are called essential packages of health services, basic packages of health services, health benefits packages. They have different names. But regardless, it's a document or a policy or a strategy outlining health services that are supposed to be available for the entire population. Some sort of fundamental health services available for all. And what she did in her thesis was to look at these packages in 50 or so countries, and with the objective of comparing them to how SRHR is included. But before we could do that, we realized as we looked closer on these documents that what is called an essential package of health services is actually very different. So even though they have similar names or are treated in a similar way, they have large differences in how vague versus specific they are. Apologies. Good thing I'm not in class with this cough, right? So what we first had to do was try to classify them and in terms of how specific they are. Because some of them, some of them we weren't even able to locate, as you see from case 0 at the left of this slide. But in those countries that had an essential package of health services, we categorized them from 1 to 3, where the first one indicated a very aspirational document or an aspiration to have an essential package of health services. So maybe not even in existence, but rather an aspiration to create something. And on the other hand, we had very specific essential packages, which were technically oriented. They specified list of interventions and services offered. So my point here is, even though they were the same thing, they looked drastically different and then could have very different functions in a health system. Those of you who have taken the health policy course, you've seen this before. But I keep coming back at it because it is a very useful tool for understanding health policy, or in this case, the word I used was problematizing health policy. To understand policies, this triangle argues that you need to look at it from a few different dimensions. It argues for the importance of content, what is in the policy, the process under which the policy is formulated and implemented, the actors, the individuals, groups and organizations involved in policy making, and at the top corner of the triangle you have the context within which the policy is formulated and implemented. And by context you can mean cultural context, economic context, social context, etc. For example, to take a very practical and timely example, all policies now probably have to be understood in light of COVID-19. Why is a policy taken on economic relief programs, for example? Well, it's because of COVID-19, and put it into that situational context or economic context. So if you haven't familiarized yourself with it, I encourage you to do so, because it is a very useful tool when you try to unpack a health policy. And this slide is more of a reference for you in trying to, if you want to go back and use this and apply the health policy triangle on the health policy. Well, another question you can ask yourself is then, are policies important? It's a rhetorical question, and I assume that the answer might be, well, it depends, and yes, it is. In the following slide, there's a video which I would like you to watch. And I'll play it for you, and then I'll come back.
Has its own needs, but shares the common goal of health. The United States deplores that some countries politicize the negotiation over this declaration by including language that has been used to promote abortion as healthcare and promote sex education that diminishes the protective role of the family in improving health. This morning, the United States was joined by 18 other nations representing greater than 1.3 billion of the world's population in issuing a joint statement, respectfully calling on member states to join us in concentrating on topics that unite rather than divide on the critical issues surrounding access to healthcare. The United States joins consensus on today's political declaration in recognition of the importance of better health for all. But we wish to state clearly that we dissociate from paragraph 68 of the declaration. We do not accept the terms sexual and reproductive health and sexual and reproductive health and reproductive rights in this declaration, and note that only documents approved by the General Assembly may inform their understanding and implementation. These terms must always include language which some countries blocked to remind UN agencies that each nation has the sovereign right to implement related programs and activities consistent with their laws and policies, and that these terms in no way imply that there is an international right to abortion. There is no such right. Healthcare exists to improve health and preserve human life, the universal goal we all share. President Trump and I are working to deliver better health for the United States, and the United States stands ready.
I'm sure that some of you recognize the person in this video. It's Dr. Azar, the health minister of the United States. He delivered the speech almost exactly a year ago at a high-level meeting on universal health coverage, which was held in New York in connection to the UN General Assembly. And what he's referring to here, what he basically is saying is that while the United States joined the consensus on a declaration that was taken on sort of reinforcing the commitment to universal health coverage, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals targets, he at the same time said that while we joined the consensus, and listen again if you didn't hear that clearly, he said that the United States dissociates themselves from paragraph 68 of the declaration. And this is part of the text of the declaration. You can find it online if you want to see more. So what's in that paragraph 68 that the Minister Azar is so keen on dissociating himself from? Well, paragraph 68 was something that was negotiated into the declaration from the countries that were sort of leading the advocacy work for sexual and reproductive health and rights. And they wanted to have writings in the declaration about part of UHC target should be that we by 2030 should have universal access to sexual and reproductive health care services, including family planning, information and education. And this is all in accordance with the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development and decisions taken there already back in 1994. And so the US, on the one hand, they join consensus and sort of stand behind the declaration, but at the same time they dissociate themselves from this specific paragraph. Another example of a strategy, a more regional one, is the SADC SRHR strategy. And this is also an interesting, sort of illustration of how a policy can sort of both be ratified and have support behind it, and at the same time be almost a bit contradictory. As you're all probably aware, abortion laws vary heavily between different countries. And in sub-Saharan Africa, we have everything from quite liberal abortion laws, such as in South Africa, to very restrictive in countries like Madagascar and Angola. And this map illustrates the level of the restriction in abortion laws in different countries on the African continent and Middle Eastern region. So while we have that, at the same time you have the SADC, which is a joint cooperation organization in sub-Saharan Africa, and they have developed an SRHR strategy which goes from 2018 to 2030. And this strategy, it mentions abortion 38 times. It explicitly encourages member states to provide safe abortion services. And all 15 countries, so the 15 countries, basically the 15 countries at the bottom of the continent, have signed this document and subscribed to it. So while you have countries which have very restrictive abortion laws, at the same time they're prepared to sign a declaration where member states are encouraged to provide safe abortion services and thereby give a political commitment to provide safe abortion services. And I put a question mark in this because to me, it doesn't really make sense, right? And that's what I mean in terms of saying that it's one way of what you politically declare and another thing what you practically do. A final example of a contradiction, or not contradiction, but to see the difference rhetoric used in different forums is this quotation. This quotation was given by a health minister in a sub-Saharan African country in 2016 in a meeting we had. So basically she said, Jesper, I can provide abortions in my country, but I cannot talk about abortions. And that was a bit of the opposite to the SADC strategy, which explicitly mentions abortion, right? So here you have a person saying like, I can provide abortion to my population, but don't put me on the barricades to talk about abortions, because that will only make life difficult in terms of providing them. So her assessment was that in her context, she could not take the political battle about pushing for safe and legal abortion. But as long as you didn't talk about it, it was much easier to continue to provide abortion services to women and adolescents. Back on camera, I hope. Some technical glitches, but I hope you bear with me. So second point then is try to relativize. What is the problem? And this I'll go through fairly quickly, but basically I'll use some of the data from the ICPD meeting in Nairobi last year. That was a big meeting following up the 25-year anniversary of the first International Conference on Population and Development held in Cairo in 1994. So last year in November, thousands of delegates from all over the world gathered in Nairobi to try to sort of, look at the unfinished agenda and how we take things forward. And leading up to that, of course, everybody wanted to acknowledge the remarkable progress that has been made over the last 25 years since that first conference. And we looked at declines in, for example, as in this slide, the declines in maternal mortality over the last 25 years. You can see in 1990, 2000, 2015, how it has gradually declined. And but still, in 2015, 216 women died out of every 100,000 live births in 2015. So we're still off track to get to the Sustainable Development Goal target of 70 deaths for every 100,000 live births by 2030. We can also see the huge inequities in terms of how progress has been made, where countries in different parts of the world has made different progress and reached different levels. And we can see from this slide that a large share of the challenge related to maternal mortality remains in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and in some countries in Middle East and Northern Africa. So based on this, they formulated the unfinished agenda. And this is a slide summarizing a bit of the challenge that we have ahead of us. For example, we still have 25 million unsafe abortions occurring in the world every year. We have 200 million victims of female genital mutilation. We have millions of people lacking HIV treatment, and we have hundreds of millions of new sexually transmitted infections. We still have millions of children dying, neonatal deaths, and we have hundreds of millions of women who have an unmet need for contraception. So huge challenges remain, and they formulated this as the unfinished agenda. And based on that, they formulated 3 targets. All good things are 3, right? And that was getting to 0. So by 2030, we should be ending preventable maternal deaths. By 2030, we should end unmet need for family planning. And by 2030, we should be ending gender-based violence and all harmful practices. So this is, you could argue then, the current policy goal, the current global policy goal related to SRHR, getting to 0. So let's dig into the third part. Prioritize. What do we do? Well, this requires a bit of a backdrop, right? So first of all, the Sustainable Development Goals. Definitely a policy opportunity to advance SRHR. I have highlighted the key goals that mention SRHR and include SRHR. Goal number 3 and goal number 5. Goal number 3 is about good health and well-being, and goal number 5 covering gender equality. And within these, we have a few targets. It's all measured against targets. And you have been over this before, but let me reiterate it a bit. And for example, these 4 I highlight as maybe some of the most critical targets for SRHR. To reduce global maternal mortality, to ensure universal access to SRH services, achieve universal health coverage, and ensure universal access to sexual reproductive health and reproductive rights. So there is a strong policy commitment globally for SRHR, right? And there is a strong policy commitment for universal health coverage. And what we argue, and what I have argued in parts of my research, is that these two are intimately linked, right? And this is what I want to frame as maybe a unique policy window. You can make different arguments for how these two are linked, but I'll mention a few. And I talk about the rights argument, the financial argument, and the common sense argument. First of all, the rights argument. The right to health services according to need and SRHR are inseparable. If we subscribe to the notion that we have a right to health, well, then one cannot shy away from SRHR, as so many of the fundamental health needs are related to people's sexual and reproductive health. So if you subscribe to the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the right to health, you cannot separate that from addressing SRHR needs. The second argument I often make is the financial argument. And this builds on the fact that SRHR interventions are often low cost, they're cost saving and cost effective. There's a varying degree of evidence of different SRHR interventions, but for example, we know that cost effectiveness of family planning, antenatal care, and HIV treatment are all well established. These are interventions that will eventually be a good investment health-wise. And the third one is what I call the common sense argument, that some of the largest health needs with potential health gains at an often low cost are SRHR. And then of course it makes perfect sense, it makes common sense. So based on that, I formulated this mathematical model called UHC loves SRHR equals true. And again, this was part of what we framed around the ICPD 25, the International Conference on Population and Development held in Nairobi last year. And as part of elaborating that link a bit, we produced a document where we said SRHR an essential element of universal health coverage. And as part of that, we introduced a concept called a comprehensive approach to SRHR. And that is what is illustrated in this figure. And I'll try to walk you through it to explain it a bit in more detail. But basically it builds on a number of dimensions where a comprehensive approach to SRHR includes adopting a comprehensive definition of SRHR, providing essential SRHR interventions, having a life course approach to SRHR, and finally addressing cross-cutting principles in delivering these. So for the first dimension, a comprehensive definition of SRHR. In 2018, the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission released their big report on SRHR. And part of the big novelty of that report was an expanded and integrated definition of sexual and reproductive health and rights, and that's what's in this box. If you haven't read or skimmed through, and I think it's part of your readings for this course, definitely have a look at this definition, because it's the first time a comprehensive definition that's also jointly agreed and encompasses sexual rights. So that's the starting point. For comprehensively delivering SRHR, you need to subscribe to the comprehensive definition of SRHR. It's a bit of a tongue twister, this, but try to keep this in mind. So it's a comprehensive approach to SRHR and a comprehensive definition of SRHR. The second step of comprehensive SRHR is providing a set of essential SRHR interventions. And again, these are interventions, there are 9 intervention categories, and they were all introduced in the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission report as well. And it ranges from safe abortion services, detecting and preventing SGBV, infertility, sexual health and well-being, family planning, treatment of HIV, and comprehensive sexuality education. And they are non-exclusive, so they're all equally important. And I think one important message here is also that it sort of expands SRHR quite clearly beyond the health sector. Because, for example, comprehensive sexuality education is not a health intervention, it's an education intervention, which is extremely important for health. Similarly, detecting and preventing sexual gender-based violence is not something for the health sector alone. It requires, cooperation with ministries of gender if you have it. It requires, working with a social protection system to allow women or people exposed to gender-based violence to seek refuge and have an income. So it requires to shift the focus and lift your eyes looking beyond the health sector. The third dimension of comprehensive SRHR is that you have a life course approach to SRHR. And basically what this means, it's to do two things. It's one, to recognize that SRHR needs are different in different parts of your life course. While you might have the most prominent needs and biggest needs for SRHR during adolescence and reproductive age and adulthood, all life stages have their SRHR needs. As an infant and in childhood or even in post-reproductive age. They do look different, they might not be as large, but they are there. And secondly, having a life course approach is important to recognize the fact that choices you make or circumstances you are exposed to at one life stage will influence your SRHR needs in other life stages. For example, if you're a victim of gender-based violence or a survivor of gender-based violence, your SRHR needs will look different than if you're not. If you choose to have a baby, or if you fall pregnant, or if you don't, that will have big implications for your SRHR needs. If you are a victim of female genital mutilation, that will change your SRHR needs in adolescence and reproductive age and adulthood, and so on. So recognizing the fact that these change over time and they are dependent on the choices you make and the circumstances you are exposed to. Finally, I want to mention the cross-cutting principles. The fourth and final dimension of this figure is that in all this, we should adhere to principles of equity and access, that individuals in need of services can access them, irrespective of their ability to pay. Quality of care, that goods and facilities are of good quality and that services are delivered in a safe, effective, timely, efficient, integrated manner. And accountability, the fact that you evaluate, that you have transparency of the system, and that ensuring that people's needs are met and that the people responsible can be held accountable. So equity, quality of care, accountability, extremely important principles throughout. Okay, so why do I talk about this when it comes to prioritization? Well, those of you who know me and have heard me now a number of times know that something that is fundamental in the way I approach my work is that we come with limited resources, right? If we have that perspective all the time that resources are limited, it means by definition that we need to prioritize. So while I, on the other hand, present now a comprehensive approach to SRHR, which is maybe an ideal state of things, at the same time, I'm quite aware that what we have today is a very limited set of resources that we need to use in the most effective way, right? So if we think of that, say, if these are my resources, right? And if we put them here on the table and saying, if this is the pot we have, these 10 pieces of Lego, say they represent 10% of our total resources or something. On what do I spend them and for whom? Well, the Guttmacher-Lancet Commission, part of what they did was to try to present some numbers arguing for the low cost of SRHR. And if you look at the report, or if you have done already, they costed essential maternal health intervention and family planning interventions at around $10, right? And while that is in absolute terms quite cheap, it's not cheap in all countries, but it's definitely affordable, you can argue, in all countries. All countries in the world, more or less, have at least $10 to spend per person per year on healthcare. So you could meet those basic needs. And then you can argue about how you came to that cost, if that's a reasonable cost estimate, etc. But I'll stay away from that. But then, if you try to view it like this, saying it's a continuum of resources that you have in front of you, and a selection of people. At some point, you always need to consider what do you prioritize first, and what comes last. So in the beginning, maybe the cheapest, most cost-effective interventions would be, and in case that would be for SRHR antenatal care, family planning. And as you move up the continuum, you have more costly and maybe not as cost-effective interventions. All interventions should adhere to the principle that they are cost-effective, but they are that to a varying extent, and that looks different in different contexts. But it can be quite useful to think of it as a continuum. And that continuum will look different in every different context. But then to think like, what comes first? What comes second? What comes third? What comes fourth? What comes fifth? And then you can think, should all people get this? Or should it be that some services are exclusively for some population groups? Say, we focus on the women and young girls. Is this a woman? I think it is. At least maybe biological sex, who knows? And saying that, some interventions are exclusively for them. Some is for the entire population. Some are only for children. And try to have that map in your mind. And then it makes you think like, if for some reason we have less resources one year, well, we need to start take away from this end of the continuum and say, well, we still have what we prioritize first, second, third, fourth, but we won't get up to these things that we could afford before. And then those of you who have heard me before, well, what we want to argue for is both to get more resources over time, but also be able to do more for that. So over time, hopefully, we will get more cubes and we can provide more services. And the way this is phrased in much of the academic literature and also in different presentations from, for example, UNFPA is the concept of progressive realization. Well, we recognize that countries can't do everything to start with, right? If you're a resource-poor country starting off on UHC reform and you want to move towards UHC, you need to define what can we do now and for whom. We can't provide everything. We're only here. We only have, if we say this is $10, we only have $40. Well, maybe the things you do first are the same, but you only get up to here. And then what you want them to have is a plan for how do we make the envelope grow and what services do we include as we do that. And maybe what additional groups of the population can we actually cover with these services. But at any given point, we have what we have, and we need to make trade-offs between things. That has become strikingly clear in the current COVID-19 pandemic, when resources say that this is the priority that we had. And we said it included family planning, it included antenatal care. But all of a sudden comes COVID and disrupts everything. And for different reasons, we can no longer prioritize family planning right now. Or we don't have the resources for it, or we don't have the manpower. So it crowds out or disrupts services. We need to focus on pandemic control right now. So keep that perspective with you as you approach SRHR policy. It is about progressive realization, it's about effectively managing resources, it's about prioritizing between groups and needs, and doing that, keeping in mind the important and principle of equity and access, that those in most needs should get services first, and there should be equity in how resources are distributed and how much you contribute. So, in summary, for this lecture on SRHR and policy, first of all, we talked about problematizing. You need to problematize your SRHR policy. You need to understand it further, you need to unpack it. There are tools in health policy that can help you do that, and you need to do that to understand, the context in which it was formed, the content of the policy itself, the processes for formulating and implementing the policy, and the actors involved. Having such an understanding makes policy much more comprehensible. Secondly, you need to relativize. How big is the problem? Compare it to different other problems. We took the case of the ICPD conference and the unfinished agenda. What is it we're dealing with here? What's the magnitude of the problem? Thirdly, I argue that we need to prioritize. We argue for comprehensive SRHR, which is a comprehensive definition of SRHR, an essential set of SRHR interventions, having a life course approach, and principles of equity, quality of care, and accountability. However, very few countries will achieve that in the near future, and therefore we need to prioritize what we do today. If resources are finite, which we know they are, we need to prioritize according to need and according to what is most cost effective. Having those principles in mind can help you understand how to unpack SRHR policy, how to understand the magnitude of the problem, and how to identify the way moving forward. Good luck, and thank you so much for listening today.